Hey everybody, welcome to my channel, Northwest Small Batch Brewing. I'm Steven, and today's video is going to be covering how I built or came up with my recipe for last week's beer, the Wee Heavy, the Scotch Ale. So if you haven't seen that video, I will put a link, as always, up in the corner that you can click on if you want to go check that out first and check out the full grain to glass video on my Wee Heavy. But I thought it would be interesting for some just to see how I came up with the recipe. Before I get started, I'm going to pour myself a beer. This is, Pono Brewing, but I'll tell you what, that's not how I read that when I first saw it. Some picture of a lady on there, I don't know, it says All My Love with an M-A-I, and it says it's a berry stout, 5.5% ABV, 39 IBU, so it's going to be a bitter berry stout. It says it's got raspberries and blackberries and Marion berries from Oregon, which is where I'm at. So, yeah, I'm not going to go any further. Let's just open this. While I'm pouring this, hey, if you've seen my channel, you've seen my videos, and you like them, it would help me out a lot if you would consider doing that YouTube-y thing and look down and hit the subscribe button. Really helps the channel, and let's be honest, it keeps me motivated to keep putting out more videos. Hopefully I didn't overpour that. Okay, well, let's get started. So the Scottish Ale is really, it's a malty, right, relatively high gravity, high alcohol beer with low amounts of hops or bitterness. So again, you won't be able to see it, and I actually spilled stuff on this. I mean, that's what happens. It makes it real, right? And this little scratch paper of all of those notes I took. Believe it or not, so the first thing I did is I went out to the National Homebrewers, or National Brewers Association. I'll put it up on the screen. They have a website, and they have all the different beer styles listed and what they define as, you know, the requirements to meet that style. So for this Scotch Ale, this Wee Heavy, the original gravity has to be between 1072 and 1085. The final gravity between 1016 and 1028. The ABV between 6.6 and 8.5. And then the IBU is between 25 and 35. That's pretty much all it said besides a little description of the beer itself. Smelling some off flavors in this Pono Brewing Berry Stout. It's probably from the fruit, but we'll see how it tastes here in a second. All right, so that's the first starting point. I always go to there first to see what the guidelines are for making the beer so you can fit everything into those guidelines. Then I just started doing a lot of research on what kind of grain winning homebrew competitions, like beers that won Scottish Ale or Wee Heavy competitions, and what kind of grain bills they used and at what percentages or ratios of the grain that they use. So I took all that into account, and I basically decided to make one that was kind of the, use the same grains that the majority of others use. There's always going to be a few that have a grain or two in there that are like off, that are not the same as the others. It's not wrong. I just wanted to make something that I knew would fit pretty well with the style. So I went with, I knew that the majority of it was going to be a pale malt. So 99% pale malt. And what I did is actually split that because I found that you could also use Munich. And I love Munich malt. And this is a European beer. So I decided to go with, do I have percentages? Yeah, 70% pale ale, right? And then I went with about 12 or so percent of Munich. So we're talking 90 or a little over 90% of this beer is just base malt. I'll tell you in a second what I think. I gotta try a few more sips of that before I have to think about this. All right, so that's the first thing. That's how I came up with the base grain. And then as I kept looking through it, There were different kinds of dark malts. Some used chocolate, some used, I don't know, other things, but black malt is why I ended with deciding to go with, because that's what the majority you're using. 2% was the ratio for that one. I ended up with, 2.5% basically of black malt. What else? Wheat. There is wheat or sugar in these beers. I don't like putting sugar in my beers unless it's like an amber Belgian candy sugar, because the amber from it gives like caramel flavors. But sugar, for the sake of sugar, just to up the ABV, all it does is thin out the beer without giving it any body. And I'm just not a big fan of doing that. So I decided I would prefer to use wheat instead. And I already had leftover torrified wheat, so I just decided to use torrified wheat because that's what I had on hand. If I did it again, though, it would be fine to use regular wheat malt, and that was 3% of the bill is what I was supposed to use. I ended up with 3% of the bill, so perfect. Already said Munich and pale. What else did I put in here? It's not really on my list. Caramel malt. I guess I didn't really write it down on my notes, but caramel malt was used in most of the recipes for those beers that were made in winning competitions in a small amount. So I was trying to decide whether I wanted to use a light caramel or dark caramel. The darker caramels, like the higher Lovibonds, tend to be more bitter and astringent, so I decided to go with a lighter 10 Lovibond crystal caramel malt. And again, that was about 11%. And generally speaking, this is just for your knowledge, you don't really ever want to go over about 10% or so with caramel malt. You want to watch that because it can get kind of clingy and not good. What else did I have in here? Roasted barley. So I was going to use like 1% smoked malt. I was going to use like an apple smoked malt. And I thought, oh, that would be cool. I started reading up on it, and I found out it's a misconception. There really is not supposed to be any smoked malt in a traditional wee heavy or Scotch ale, especially not peated malt. So I just decided not to do it. I've kicked myself before by adding stuff I thought would be amazing, and then it ended up ruining the beer. So I just decided I'm not going to do it. At least not the first time around. If I make it again sometime, I might throw some in and see what happens. So instead of using 1% of like a smoked malt, I decided to go the roasted barley, because the roasted barley can actually give just the faintest hints of smokiness, even though it's not smoked. And so I decided to go with that. And then it's not technically on the recipe, but I always throw in up to about 5% carapils. So I threw in a pound of carapils just for mouthfeel and head retention and all that stuff. All right, let me quickly get through the rest of this. Hops were basically two options: East Kent Goldings or Fuggles. And I decided to go with East Kent Goldings because the majority of this type of beer, that's what they used. Also, when I kind of broke it down, some people did aroma hops and some didn't. I decided to do it because I was able to put in about an ounce, almost a little over an ounce and a half, right? 1.6 ounces, and still not hit the IBUs. So I added another 3/4 of an ounce at 10 minutes for like aroma and flavor. And it still only brought me up to 25 IBU, which is just the very bare minimum anyway that you're supposed to have for this particular beer. As far as yeast goes, I always use a dry yeast. That was a little bit of a problem on this one because there's not a lot of yeast that are specifically made for making a Scotch ale. You have two options. You can go with Mangrove Jack Empire Ale yeast. It's an M15. Or you can go with the traditional SAF Ale SO4, which will leave you a little drier. Either one of those is fine, but you want to pitch 2 packets because of the high gravity numbers on this, and you also want to put in some yeast nutrient to sort of help it. Anytime when you have this high in alcohol content, you want to do a little extra stuff like that to help things out. Definitely not a beginner beer. Really high alcohol beers and heavy things like this are not good starter beers if you've never brewed before. I did pressure ferment so that I could sort of hold back any esters and those kinds of things, hold those down. That's about it for this recipe. There's not a whole lot more in here. There was specific directions on the yeast when it came to these. It did say like to pitch it at a lower temperature, 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 10 to 16 Celsius for 3 weeks, and then bump it down after that to 35 to 45 Fahrenheit, which is 2 to 7 Celsius for another like 6 to 12 weeks. But I would note that you should always look at the packet and look up your yeast and follow the range that it has on the yeast packet, because they know already what the yeast is going to like. And so I would stick to the colder side of the range on this one, because you're trying to actually stop esters and things from adding extra flavors that you don't want. That's it. I don't have more for you. That's how I came up with this heavy Scotch ale. Of course, you can always look at YouTube channels. The Apartment Brewer has a really good video for a wee heavy. That's a really good one to look at. And he goes into super great detail about the whole thing and the history and everything. So at any rate, hope you found that helpful, and thanks for sticking around. As far as this beer goes, the berry flavor on it is not that great. I think I would just prefer, no berry flavor. But it's not bad. It's a beer. It's good, right? So I will see you back here in a week for the next full video. And so until then, thanks for stopping by. Thanks for viewing. Thanks for subscribing. And as always, keep on brewing.